You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Buick. News, views and interviews in association with FE News.
Hello, I'm Tom Buick. If you're listening to this, it must be Skills World Live. And in a week when we went back to the future with a new, or was it the old Level 3 Lifetime Skills Guarantee? The old codgers amongst you may remember in 1999 when the National Skills Task Force called for the A-level equivalent entitlement. Lo and behold, Doc Brown, aka Gordon Brown, over at the Treasury duly obliged. And until 2013, all adults in England had free access to the qualifications. Roll up, Bojo, your High Wire Act Prime Minister, promised at Exeter College this week to end the academic vocational divide and place technical skills at the heart of the nation's productivity agenda. Except that was the stated aim of the Department for Education in a white paper in 2003, and again in 2005, and again in 2010, and wait for it, in 2013 as well. It seems Doc Brown and that clapped out old DeLorean automobile has a few more repetitive miles left in the tank yet. Talking of car crashes, did you catch up with the multiple lane pile-up that was Gillian Keegan's appearance on the mainstream media this week? Got to say though, my sympathies are with the Skills Minister, because once again, faced with the prospect of BBC Radio 4 having to discuss a topic they neither care or know absolutely nothing about, all these sneering hacks can do is deploy the gotcha interview. Even that upstart station, Times Radio, was straying into fake news territory about the PM's announcements this week, until our very own sector press baron, Nick Linford, managed to gatecrash the programme to give them a timely lesson in skills policy fact-checking. Stand up and stand by, folks, for another 60 glorious minutes of informed chat and topical debate as once again we connect the world of FE.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Buick.
On tonight's programme, we can definitely reiterate our radio lifetime guarantee of some of the best voices and leaders in the global skills community. In the big debate and live phone chat segments of the show this evening, we'll be revisiting Education Secretary Gavin Williamson's pledge to introduce a German-style technical education system. I've been talking to the German-born Andreas Schleicher from the OECD based in Paris and Dr. Robert Lerman of the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., both of them internationally acclaimed experts on apprenticeships and technical education. Don't go away though, folks, because in the last two segments of tonight's programme, I'll be exploring the pros and cons of the Teutonic dual model with a selection of Anglo-German guests who know the difference, I can tell you, between a Meister and a Beruf. And if that stellar lineup is stopping short of floating your ballcock this evening, then don't call for a plumber. Just get your ears around this nostalgic track as Charlie XCX reminds us of what it was like in 1999.
I just wanna go back to 1999. Take a ride to my old neighborhood. I just wanna go back. Sing hit me baby one more time. Wanna go back, wanna go. Yeah, I just wanna go back. Nike Air so back. CD on Mercedes. Drive around listening to Shady like never under pressure. Those days it was so much better. Feeling cool in my youth, relaxing, no money, no problem. It was easy back then. Oh, wish that we could go back in time. Got memories. Oh, maybe we could do it tonight. I just wanna go back to 1999. Take a ride to my old neighborhood. I just wanna go back. So hit that baby one more time. Wanna go back, wanna go.
Yeah, I remember back home. Best friends all night, no phone. No cares, I was dumb and so young. My roots singing Michael Jackson. Never under pressure. Those days it was so much better. Feeling cool in my youth and Mexican.
Does anyone remember how we did it back then? Oh, wish that we could go back in time. Got memories. Oh, maybe we could do it tonight, tonight, tonight.
I just wanna go back to 1999. Take a ride to my old neighborhood. I just wanna go back, sing hit me baby one more time. Wanna go back, wanna go back to where we came from, playing air guitar on the roof, in the kitchen over the table, like we had the beautiful view. I wanna go, I just wanna go back to 1999.
Want to know the future of apprenticeships in England? Then you can't afford to miss this showcase online conference, The Future of Apprenticeships, Delivering the Opportunity Guarantee. Coming up on the 5th of November, join ministers, employers and sector leaders in an interactive debate. Meet with other apprenticeship training providers, endpoint assessment organisations, tutors and apprentices as we recover from the pandemic together. Importantly, find out how the changes to apprenticeships will affect you. Book your ticket today. www.futureofapprenticeships.com. That's futureofapprenticeships.com.
Time now to find out what's been making the news headlines in your skills world this week. Prime Minister Boris Johnson this week announced a lifetime skills guarantee. In a speech given to FE students at Exeter College, the PM said that from next April, about 1 in 3 of the population will be eligible for free college courses and qualifications at level 3, or the equivalent of A-level. Boris Johnson also waded into the debate about the value of taxpayers' money, of mass higher education.
But we also need to recognise that a significant and growing minority of young people leave university and work in a non-graduate job and end up wondering whether they did the right thing. Was it sensible to rack up that debt on that degree?
In other news, FE trades unions are calling for a substantial pay rise for lecturers and staff. Citing the £400 million uplift in baseline funding granted to colleges last year, the National Education Union's Joint General Secretary Mary Bowstead said it was time that a decade of real-term pay cuts for FE college staff was reversed. The Association of Colleges has recommended a 1% pay increase. And finally, Skills Minister Gillian Keegan has written to the Black FE Leadership Group this week saying that she is committed to eliminate racism and to address racial inequalities in further education. The pledge comes as diversity in the appointment of black and minority ethnic senior staff in FE has gone backwards in recent years.
Contact us at Skills World Live. We want to hear from you. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter at Skills World Live, at Tom Buick. Use the hashtag Skills World Live. Call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111.
Now, if you've been following the news closely, or indeed you've got some of your own offspring at university, then you'll know that there's been chaos unleashed on many of our higher education campuses this week. No sooner was the non-existent Freshers' Week ball over, and we started to hear about students being told they wouldn't be allowed to go home for Christmas. Can you believe it? And with entire halls of residents placed into self-isolation. Meanwhile, domestic students, including international learners spending up to £30,000 a year for a degree, have complained bitterly that they are not getting the customer experience that they paid for. We've repeatedly invited the university's Minister, Michelle Donnellan, to appear on this programme, but each time her press officers at the Department for Education have declined. Not to worry, though. The age of political accountability is still with us, and I was pleased to be able to catch up with the Shadow University's Minister earlier, Emma Hardy MP, who I put the question to her: could any of the COVID-related chaos we are seeing unfolding on our campuses been avoided?
To a degree, yes. And I do want to say that I really do appreciate the work that universities have done. They have worked incredibly hard to make their campuses COVID secure, and I try wherever possible to really push that message home. But it feels that they've been badly let down by government. They were promised that we'd have this test, track and trace working effectively, that they hold up their end of the deal. They make campuses COVID secure. They arrange for students to return. They limit the number of people on campus. They've done all of that. What we needed was test, track and trace working, and it hasn't worked. And I do feel that they've been badly let down. And just generally with the lack of leadership, and I've spoken about this before, it feels like this is an issue that's been pushed onto universities and not sort of actually taken and grappled with by government. And you saw this from the letter that Gavin Williamson sent out to local authorities on the 23rd of September saying, oh, you need to work with our universities to have a plan. I mean, many universities had done this months ago, had worked together and actually developed a plan. But the fact that they were sort of all left individually does feel like they've been let down by government. And it would have been good maybe to have a little bit more coordination across the sector. But, I recognise that they are in a competitive environment, and that will, of course, influence.
Yeah, on that coordination point within a competitive environment, of course, back in June, the infection rate, of course, wasn't anything like the scale it is now. And there was obviously a lot of pressure just to open up the economy, never mind getting students back into educational settings. But perhaps benefit of hindsight, I mean, given that the student population by definition is a migratory one and people from all sorts of different parts of the country and mixed households are coming together. I mean, I just wonder whether, again, in hindsight, it was perhaps a bit too premature to see these students come back in the form they have, because by definition, they're perhaps super spreaders, as the epidemiologists like to call them.
Yeah, and there was lots of sort of bubbling voices talking about this at the time. I mean, some people advocating for a staggered return. Of course, the UCU came out from the starting blocks quite early and talking about it needing to be online only, and sort of different universities were left to grapple with this. And as I say, grapple with it as individual institutions by themselves. And I do wonder how much the competitive environment sort of influenced the offer they were making. Because if you also think back to June, there was real concerns about how many students would defer, whether or not domestic students would come, would the international students come, how viable were universities as institutions. So all of this was going on in the background, and there was sort of a real need to secure the numbers to keep the institution going. And I wonder how much that sort of fear of being the first university to say, actually, we're not going to bring our undergraduates back until January, and what impact that could have had on potential student numbers actually put off some universities making that decision, which is why, government should have been able to make that decision almost for the sector and sort of show that leadership and bring everyone together. And I'm sort of wondering now what's going to happen as the situation evolves, or whether or not we'll see individual institutions start to say, well, actually, we're going to have to send some students home, especially in areas where there's been high breakouts. But I think this goes down to the fundamental problems, which I've mentioned a few times, the way that higher education is financed and the unintended consequences and behaviour that can drive.
Yeah, I mean, in a consumer-orientated system, I guess none of the universities wanted to let, as they see it, their customers down. And how do you think do we ensure, though, going forward, given some of those financial pressures, that students don't continue to feel shortchanged in relation to their higher education?
Yeah, I think it's also worth stressing that it's not cheaper to deliver courses online. And I've spoken to many vice chancellors who explained to me that actually in some ways it's more expensive. And of course, many universities have bought laptops and connectivity for their students. And, we know that there's these problems with the digital divide and finding space for some students to continue to work at home. So all of these are considerations that I think need to be taken into account.
Emma Hardy, Shadow Education Minister for the Labour Party, thank you so much for joining the show this evening.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Buick.
Crashing, hit a wall. Right now, I need a miracle. Hurry up now, I need a miracle. Stranded, reaching out. I call your name, but you're not around. I say your name, but you're not around. I need ya, I need ya, I need you right now. Yeah, I need you right now. So don't let me down. I think I'm losing my mind now. It's in my head, darling. I hope that you'll be here when I need you the most. So don't let me down. 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 Running out of time. I really thought you were on my side, but now there's nobody by my side. I need ya, I need ya, I need you right now. Yeah, I need you right now. So don't let me down. I think I'm losing my mind now. It's in my head, darling. I hope that you'll be here when I need you the most. So don't let me down. 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 Oh, I think I'm losing my mind now, yeah. Oh, I think I'm losing my mind now, yeah. I need ya, I need you right now. Yeah, I need you right now. So don't let me down. I think I'm losing my mind now. It's in my head, darling. I hope that you'll be here when I need you the most. So don't let me down. Don't let me down. Don't let me down. Yeah, don't let me down. Yeah, don't let me down. Don't let me down. So don't let me down. Don't let me down. Don't let me down.
That was the Chainsmokers and Don't Let Me Down. A phrase I often find myself using when I get on a Southern Rail train up to London. Talking of competence and skills, on tonight's show we're focusing on the question, does England need a German-style skills system? I've got to say, when the great leader of Sanctuary Buildings, Great Smith Street, London, came out with this mantra, it left me rather perplexed. I thought to myself, does Gavin Williamson know anything about the history of technical education in this country? Indeed, I wrote a whole article about it on FE News if you care to look it up. I was perplexed because almost everything the Education Secretary set out in his big FE speech earlier this summer was about as German style as going to Berlin expecting to watch a game of cricket. Then there was the lack of ambition or patriotism, it seemed, for building on some of the great traditions of the English model. After all, it was the German-born English MP for Banbury, Bernard Samuelson, who was the chair, actually, of the 1882 Royal Commission on Scientific and Technical Instruction, who said, a politician who says we need to copy the system of another state has neither real ambition for his country or an original idea of his own. So I thought I would seek out the views of two international experts on this subject, who've both studied Germany's and England's tertiary education models. First up is Andreas Schleicher, the researcher and statistician at the OECD, who's sort of mildly famous for his PISA and PIAC work on international skills attainment and assessment. After him, you'll hear from Dr. Robert Lerman of the Urban Institute, based in Washington, D.C. He's also the visiting professor at the IZA University in Bonn. I started by asking Andreas whether he thought England was headed for a German-style FE system.
Well, I think England has put greater emphasis on apprenticeships, but it's still a quite different approach. In Germany, you have a much closer integration of the world of work and the world of learning. So when you do an apprenticeship, the work-based component would be much more significant than what you find in the UK. It's also for most young people a much more attractive kind of choice in terms of opening career opportunities later on.
Mention there the fact that in Germany there's more of a culture around apprenticeships. There's definitely more of a focus on that balance between the work-based training and the training that takes place in the vocational schools. I mean, we've just had a survey here in England that's found that quite a high percentage of apprentices are not even getting the 20% off-the-job training, which equates to roughly a day a week. In Germany, there isn't such a problem there, is there, with employers releasing their apprentices for the off-the-job training?
No, actually, it's also that many young people actually go for an apprenticeship. It's in England, it's sort of typically something that employed people would do to upgrade their skills. In Germany, it's actually also a preferred route for many young people rather than everybody going to university. So it's generally more open. And yes, employers are quite willing to open up opportunities because it's in the long run to a great benefit to them to have better skilled people, better skilled employees, and particularly people with skills that are relevant to the workplace. Working with real people on real problems is a big kind of benefit for employers these days.
Mm. So the Secretary of State for Education here in England, Gavin Williamson, has set this ambition of England adopting, and I quote, a more German-style technical education system. What, in your view, as an international expert, you know the English system well, you know the German and indeed other systems well, what are the 3 or 4 key things then does he have to do from a policy perspective to get anywhere close to this German-style system?
I think public policy can set the framework for that and create better incentives for people. And that, for example, includes putting young people who want to pursue those routes at least on a level playing field with those going to higher education in terms of access to financing. I think that's a big gap. Currently, I also think it includes investing in apprenticeships as much as the UK invests in higher education. So I think that's something that government can do. But actually, the big challenge is to get real buy-in from employers in this. These kind of systems, the dual systems, only work if employers see intrinsic merit in this, and that requires facilitation for small and medium-sized enterprises. Big employers have no difficulties with adopting such a system. I think big enterprises have the infrastructure, the support, the critical mass of people. But if you're a small and medium-sized enterprise, you need maybe want to share apprentices. You want to share training facilities. So I think these are areas where governments can invest. But actually, it's not just Germany or Austria or Switzerland. Actually, recently, many countries, if you look to Denmark, Norway, Korea, there's been many countries doing these things quite successfully. So I think if that is an aspiration in England, I do think there's a way to do this.
As you say, the key to this is around employer engagement, employer investment. Here in England, the apprenticeship levy has been in place since 2017. It's a levy, a tax essentially on large firms, and that pays for the whole apprenticeship system. In Germany, though, there's also a kind of a levy, but it's not collected by the tax authority, is it? It's collected by the chambers of commerce. So there's that employer ownership, that employer purchase. Do you think that's potentially one of the key weaknesses of the English system? The large employers are paying for the apprenticeship system, and the small and medium-sized enterprises struggle to get access to that cash in order to take on the apprenticeships. I mean, do you think that is something that needs to be looked at from a public policy perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think, this is something, first of all, I think it's very important to make those apprenticeships and work-based learning opportunities of genuine benefit to employers. So that it's not just you do this because you otherwise have to pay some tax or penalties, but you do that because it's actually, part of your talent pipeline. I think that's for me the most important part. But then, yes, I think this is something that access to financing and more importantly, access to often training facilities. If you're a small employer, money alone may not help you because you really need to have an infrastructure, training facilities. You may want to, co-share an apprentice with another small enterprise. And I think it's that kind of facilitation that is most important. The social partnership is really the key. The money is, always important, but investing in strong social partnership at the very local level is, in my view, the most central part.
Two phrases you use there, social partnership and then local level. Again, looking at the English system in terms of how it differs markedly then from the Germanic systems, there isn't that tradition of social partnership. In fact, if anything, the unions, although with some examples, good examples, but it's not a tradition of unions and employers working together around the provision of, for example, technical education and apprenticeships. And of course, we have a very centralised system in England where the funding and the policies driven from the centre, again with some exceptions because there's been devolution to some of the mayoral combined authorities. I mean, is that really, again, something that if the Secretary of State's heart is set on a more German-style system, getting that devolution both out to employers and out to localities is going to be critical?
Yeah, but I think actually you can create those kinds of partnership because, there are benefits for all sides. There's a benefit for the employer, there's a benefit for the employee, and I think that's a very, very important part to make this attractive also. And it's a benefit to local economies and government. So I think actually it's not so rocket science to create those social partnerships, but it needs to get really beyond the financial relationship. It's really about thinking about, skills demand. It's about thinking about curriculum design. It's thinking about how the training is best shared between, educational institutions and the workplace. In my view, there's been a relative overemphasis on providing training in, facilities in sectors that are not part of the workplace. And I think that's something important to change.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Buick.
So England has as we've discussed, has a very different approach, obviously, to the secondary phase of education, particularly technical education, but that's not an insurmountable problem. In fact, the government in England's introducing these new technical levels at 16 as a means of creating that technical pathway in the secondary phase. You mentioned there the standards. As you said, it's a very involved process. It's more of a social partnership, more of a tripartite approach in Germany. In England, we have the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education that is, if you like, the developer and the guardian of the standards. In fact, there are well over 600 of those standards now, either in operation or in development, not least because they also encompass the degree level apprenticeship standards, not a feature, of course, per se, of the German system, which has less standards overall than England currently does. Talk to us about the financing then of apprenticeships, because again, from what I can see, another big difference between England and Germany, even though there is this thing in England called the apprenticeship levy, essentially a tax on large employers that pays for the whole of the apprenticeship model, about £2.5 billion. In Germany, apprenticeships are financed differently, aren't they? Just tell us about that.
Well, the individual firms pay for the on-the-job training, the mentoring, and the state pays for the off-job learning mainly through their secondary schools. One thing about those schools is that the vocational teachers are very skilled and are paid a very high amount. And often, even within the school component, there's a lot of hands-on learning there as well. So I think that financing of the off-job learning is not just a financial issue. It's also the way they try to embed quality.
That was America's top apprenticeship expert, my good friend, Bob Lerman. If you're interested in hearing more of that insightful interview, then do head over to the new skillsworldlive.com TV channel, where you can now watch some of these great interviews in glorious visual Technicolor, recorded in one of 2 new Skills World Live production studios. To continue tonight's debate, I'm delighted to be joined on the line by 2 gentlemen who definitely know their BIBB from their iFate. I'm talking about Richard Marsh, Apprenticeship Partnerships Director at Kaplan UK. Good evening, Richard. Is he on the line?
Hi, good evening. Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, good evening. Hi.
Thanks for beaming in. And Martin Houthaus, who's the Managing Director of City and Guilds Institute of Advanced Technology Network.
Hello, good evening.
Yeah, good evening to you,
evening.
Martin. Thanks for joining us. Now, Richard, let's come to you first. You've worked in the German system, and you know, of course, England's model all too well. Were you as perplexed as I was when you heard Gavin Williamson talk about creating a German-style technical education system?
Yes, I was actually. So, yeah, I spent a number of years at Volkswagen working across the UK and Germany, and, you know, got to know their systems pretty well. But I was very surprised also because he gave no context. You know, did he mean we want literally a system like theirs with early choices for young people, or did he just mean in nature we want something like the German system? It wasn't really particularly clear.
Yeah, I suppose it's the word style, isn't it? What do you mean by style?
Yeah.
Martin, likewise, I mean, you've got a lot of experience and knowledge of both systems. I mean, one of the criticisms of the Germanic models, I'm not just talking about Germany, it could be Switzerland, Austria, they are sometimes accused of being relatively rigid. I mean, it can take time for new technical occupational programs to be developed. I mean, do you think in that regard, Germany could actually learn more from England's ecosystem than perhaps is sometimes let on?
No, absolutely. So I'm German by birth, which is probably something you know, and I've worked for a German business in the UK for 18 years, and I've been responsible for that topic. So the German system works in Germany, but like any other education system, it's germane to the society it serves, and because of that, it can't be exported. The German system is very rigid. They only created 2 or 3 new occupations in the last 12 years, whilst, especially on the digital front, we have innovated all the time. So I can see some components of the German system working quite well in the UK, but by and large, our system is not that bad.
Yeah, because that's the point about any country's system, frankly, wherever it's from, is this cultural context. Richard, I mean, you mentioned that as well in your answer. You also talked about the early choices. I mean, frankly, if we were headed for anything like a German-style technical education system, there would have to be that very thorny subject raised about essentially tracking and selecting pupils at quite an early age, whether it's 11 or 14, and tracking them into these different occupational routes. I mean, as you say, you've worked in Germany. I mean, just tell our listeners more about how that tracking system works.
Well, I mean, basically, you're going around back to choices that we did away with in the 50s and 60s, you know, when we brought in secondary moderns, when you're asking people to decide what kind of secondary school they want to go to. You know, do you want to go to a vocationally based secondary school or one that is academic and going to steer you towards A-levels? And it's not realistic to think that we would be able to make that kind of fundamental choice to our secondary schooling system within a parliament or within even a generation. So I read what Williamson is saying is that we want more people studying higher level technical skills and less people studying arts degrees and arts subjects. And actually, he doesn't mean a German-style system. He means a German-style economy with higher productivity and people studying STEM subjects rather than art subjects at sort of 16 plus.
Martin, how realistic, though, do you think it is in terms of what Richard's saying there about trying to, in effect, turn a British service economy into more of the manufacturing powerhouse that, of course, Germany is famed for and still is? I mean, in a sense, that's the biggest mismatch of all, isn't it? You're trying to essentially potentially push people into a direction, whether this is level 4, level 5, higher technical skills into more STEM subjects, when in fact that isn't the nature and hasn't been for many years of a service-driven model. I mean, just look at the apprenticeship standards that have been developed, and you mentioned the rigidity of some of the German standards. Of course, there are less standards in Germany, apprenticeship standards, than there are on IFATE's books. But isn't that an example of a more expansive, sort of service-driven economy than the one that Germany has?
Well, so first of all, I have worked in the engineering and manufacturing sector in the UK for over 20 years.
Yeah.
And we have some really good world-class employers in this country, and they need to be served. However, to replicate what Germany does is impossible in the UK because the German system consists mainly of SMEs, which is the backbone in manufacturing, and they're typically family-owned and have a long history of reinvesting in the local community in which they were founded. So that is pretty much gone in this country. I would invest more in STEM skills in the areas where we are strong. And Britain is very strong in innovation. It's very strong in digitization. And by and large, we're probably the most inventive nation in Europe, if I can say that without wishing to disrespect any other nation. What we're really bad at is taking the innovation and making it commercially viable. And if you invest more in that space as part of your industrial strategy, then I think you would reap the benefits.
Indeed. Richard, what's your reflections on that? It's all about industrial strategy then, isn't it? We've got to get that right, and then the skills system will follow.
I think so, but that's too big a question for me and for this slot. What I think would be good to pick up on is, you mentioned earlier about the dual system. There is something in that we could try and harness for apprenticeships in this country. The idea of splitting the theory and the practice, between them, and that would give us, I think, to get colleges back into apprenticeships in this country, because they've fallen out of apprenticeships by and large, and actually working with the best training providers. I think you could establish a dual system for apprenticeships here that would allow colleges to get back in. And I think perhaps allow employers to have a role in assessing and delivering apprenticeships in the way that they haven't had in the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, on this subject of employers being engaged in that whole technical education journey, particularly around apprenticeships, Martin, I mean, I don't know if you caught what Andreas Schleicher was saying on the programme earlier, but he was really majoring on that point about the fact that one of Germany's great success stories, of course, has been through the chamber movement and the various sort of occupational guilds that are really quite powerful, aren't they? Within the German apprenticeship model. And Richard hinted there at some of the experiments, and arguably haven't been given a huge amount of time to bed in. But we've had sector skills councils, we've had training enterprise councils working locally. That's just in the last 3 decades, and there's talk now about even bringing in potentially our own chambers. I mean, do you think that is a missing dimension still, Martin, in the whole piece around post-compulsory education and technical skills? That just we don't have powerful enough employer bodies, do we?
Well, Andreas Schleicher and I will never agree on this, and we've been arguing about this point for 10 years. So I actually don't think that the chambers in Germany are of particular value.
All right. Why is that? Tell us why.
Well, so they are a levy-raising body. Membership is compulsory, just like the levy system that we still have in this country in construction and in engineering construction. There is no incentive to be innovative and change because it's a quasi-body that can't be switched off. And the German system is basically a meeting of friends. So you've got the government, you've got the employers, and you've got the trade unions, and they all sit around the table and they sign the standards off. But because Germany is a federal republic with 16 different states, you've got 16 different education secretaries. By the time a new standard has been developed, it's probably 5 or 6 years out of date. And the chambers that then also fund the technical schools are way behind the curve. So we are actually, I would say our best colleges are probably a lot stronger than the average German college. Because when you look at the German system in particular, for sort of blue chip companies at the top end, Bosch, Siemens, Mercedes, Benz, BMW, they all have their own colleges because the state provision is not keeping up with the pace of change.
Fascinating. Final thoughts from you both as we sort of look ahead then to whatever kind of technical education system England's going to get. What do you sort of think broadly will be the contour outlines then of the new dawn, the new beginning, the revolution that Gavin Williamson has promised. Richard, start with you.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really difficult just because we want people to study more higher level STEM subjects. Wanting isn't enough. You have to set the right incentives for individuals, employers and providers to make it happen and give them enough time to do it. And I would agree, let's work on what we do well, the inventiveness, the flexibilities we've got, rather than worrying about what anybody else is doing or copying that.
Martin, final word to you.
For me, for this to work, it needs to be linked to the industrial strategy, and providers and colleges need to be allowed to create a surplus so that they can generate the upfront investment that is required to help our industrial customers grow. Because if they get stronger, they create more jobs. If we have more jobs, we all prosper as a nation.
Indeed. At the end of the day, it is all about skills and jobs. Richard Marsh, Apprenticeship Partnerships Director at Kaplan, and Martin Hotas, Managing Director of the City and Guilds Institute Advanced Technology. Brilliant debate. Thanks so much for giving up your time this evening.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Buick.
the future of apprenticeships in England? Then you can't afford to miss this showcase online conference, The Future of Apprenticeships, Delivering the Opportunity Guarantee. Coming up on the 5th of November, join ministers, employers and sector leaders in an interactive debate. Meet with other apprenticeship training providers, endpoint assessment organisations, tutors and apprentices as we recover from the pandemic together. Importantly, find out how the changes to apprenticeships will affect you. Book your ticket today. www.futureofapprenticeships.com. That's futureofapprenticeships.com.
That track you heard there just before the break was Gary Newman and Cars, and in honour of the souped-up DeLorean automobile that appeared in that 1985 film, Back to the Future. As you know, a bit of a theme for tonight's show. Now, folks, we are going to continue tonight's big debate looking at, does England need a German-style skills system? And joining me live on the line to discuss these developments and more, I'm really pleased to welcome on the show Liz Bromley, who's Chief Executive Officer at NCG Group. Good evening, Liz.
Hello there.
Thanks for joining us. And internationally, not quite sure which country is code 598, but maybe you can enlighten me. Michael Axman, who's a Senior Specialist for Enterprises, Productivity and Skills Development at the International Labour Organisation, and Sintafor, an acronym actually, I don't know. But again, perhaps Michael can enlighten us. Michael, good evening to you.
Good afternoon to you all. I'm in Uruguay, Montevideo.
Uruguay, okay. So you're back in time. Again, great theme for tonight's show, Back to the Future. Now, look, let's start with you, Liz. If a German delegation came to the NCG Group of colleges, what would you show them as a great example then of technical education that was on a par with what Germany provides?
Well, I think we'd be able to show them our engagement with our local business communities, our interest in our local economies, and our vocational and professional training skills with our super facilities across the group and our burgeoning apprenticeship offer. Nothing's perfect because, as you know, FE has been woefully underinvested in for some years. But what we do is good stuff. We focus on the student experience and we focus on their employability.
Yeah. Michael, you work with education skills systems all over the world. Indeed, the ILO has been really active, I know, in this space over the past few years. I mean, you'll be aware that many countries have tried to implement the sort of German dual system. It doesn't always work out. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's a number of different things, Tom. First of all, I mean, you can hear from my accent that I am German. I've worked in the German skills development system for many years and now for the International Labour Organization many years. And I think what we have to keep in mind really is that, skills requirements change. And we're talking right now, COVID-19, you're talking the new challenges that are coming up for you with Brexit. So I think there's a lot of things we have to keep in mind when it comes to organizing the programs in such a way that they're responsive to labor market needs and that they're responsive to things that you need in particular economies and in labor markets. So I'm working in Latin America right now with a lot of countries, and I'm organizing a course on apprenticeships during and after COVID-19 with 5 different countries here in Latin America. And what we are looking at basically is not the German system as such, but what we call quality apprenticeships. And it's a combination of, I would say, things of social dialogue, talking to employers and involving the private sector as much as possible, identifying sectors that have growth potential, and then basically implementing these programs with financing and legal systems. And when I look at what you have in the UK, you have apprenticeship systems, but, there are countries that have many, many, many more, and they have advanced systems where, people have lots of choices. Making this something of choice, I think is very important, not only here in Latin America, but, when you talk about Germany, we have 350 different apprenticeships that are offered, and they're all very attractive. And I think this is probably something that could be used in the UK as well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the term quality apprenticeships, and of course Liz will be aware in terms of the English policy debate. We've been talking about quality for 7 years now. I mean, Liz, from your perspective, obviously running a large college group, do you think we've yet cracked that issue of what Michael's talking about the engagement, the effective engagement with employers stepping up to the plate and actually seeing apprenticeships as a real benefit to their enterprise?
I don't think we have yet. I think that the funding system, the communications that we have that make apprenticeships in many cases seem as though they're a second-rate option to go into university. These are the sorts of messages that naturally put employers off wanting to engage with FE. Some of our employers are fantastic. They get it. They have development programs clearly embedded. But for SMEs and small companies, it's difficult. Actually finding the front door to your FE college, the right college for your particular work program, can be really challenging, particularly when there are a number of colleges in a region competing for your business. So I think what we really need to do is have a much more simplified system, a very clearly signposted front door, and real respect and recognition of the value of a strongly funded, supported skills system, as well as an academic learning system. And if we could get to that dual recognition that some people will excel from practical learning and vocational training, just as some will excel from a university education, and we actually level that out, then I think employers will start to have a proper dialogue with their colleges as to what is achievable by working together.
You hint there at the competitive environment, which of course is the English model's renowned for it really around the world, and Germany arguably doesn't have quite so much competition with its vocational schools. But Michael, putting both sort of your German lens and your international lens on, do you think that all countries sort of struggle with this, getting this balance right between competitive forces in the post sort of compulsory education system where, particularly where government contracts are being handed out, they don't want necessarily just to give it to the same old players. But at the same time, if you have too much sort of rampant competition, you get sort of issues around, and I've heard various phrases over the years, but you hear race to the bottom or lowest common denominator and all the rest of it. I mean, where is the balance, do you think, from an ILO sort of international perspective between the state and the market?
Well, I would start off by saying I couldn't agree more with what Liz just said. I think it's really a question of making it an alternative option. And that is not only the case for the UK, but that's also the case here in Latin America where I work. And I remember when I was 18, some 45 years ago, and I decided to do an apprenticeship, and I came home to my mother and said, look, I have an apprenticeship contract with the Deutsche Bank. And she was delighted. She was very happy. She said, I'm so proud of you, son. This is great. And 2 years later, I decided to go to university and study economics. And she said, okay, if you want to go that way. I think this is what we have to get to, that apprenticeships become a real option and they become an attractive option. Like when we're talking about my country, in Germany, 50% of the youth do an apprenticeship, as opposed to 10% in your country, as opposed to 75% in Switzerland, for example, where it's something that is taken for granted that everybody starts with an apprenticeship and then they have a job. We're talking youth unemployment in high amounts here, and not only in Latin America during and after COVID-19, but in many, many other parts of the world. An apprenticeship is a way of getting people this first job, this premier empleo, as they say, the first job, the first opportunity to work. And, they learn and they study and they have an employment. And after the 2 years, they can decide whether they want to stay in the field where they have been working as an apprentice, like I did with the German bank, or if they do something else. But the system has to become flexible, has to become permeable, and I think it's important that either way is accepted equally. And this is something, I don't know the UK so well, but I know here in Latin America is something, okay, my child had to go to the Institute of Vocational Education because he or she didn't make it into the university. That has to change. And that can only change if you have programs that are nice and attractive and, that give the quality of vocational education that you need, that I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, look, we have a phrase in England about how vocational technical education is a wonderful idea, but it's for other people's children. And I think that talks directly to your point about prestige. You know, there are some countries like Switzerland, like Germany, where, you know, particularly large and small employers, you know, you go home and your parents are absolutely delighted that you've been offered the apprenticeship. Liz, final word to you. I mean, it's fair to say, isn't it, that we haven't quite reached those levels of prestige yet around the apprenticeships, although to be fair, the sort of glass ceiling that used to exist around modern apprenticeships, if you only go so far at level 3, level 4, that's been blown off by the fact that you can now at least do degree level apprenticeships. But where are you as a sort of FE college in that whole debate about how expansive, how prestigious our apprenticeship model should be in England? And do the degree apprenticeships answer that question or not?
Well, I think you've raised a really important point here. You know, the fact that we're actually talking about FE is a rare treat. For so many years, we've only focused on students accessing university education. We need to address the balance in the conversation and the discussions that we have on programs like this and, you know, in media campaigns. And whilst I think we need to be wary of importing a system wholesale from another country, to take the best elements, you know, the flexibility that Michael has just talked about in terms of having practical learning supplemented by an academic experience is exactly the way we should be thinking. I'm hoping that the Prime Minister's speech around the lifelong loan entitlement will give people the flexibility to shift between FE and HE, to have the opportunity to have work experience in the workplace, even if it's for a limited amount of time, to improve their understanding of what choices are available to them. And yes, let's make it prestigious to go through further education as well.
Absolutely. And we'll be dedicating actually a whole programme next Thursday to the Prime Minister's Lifetime Skills Guarantee. But for now, really grateful to Liz Bromley of the NCG Group and Michael Axman from the ILO for helping us close off tonight's show of Skills World Live. Thank you so much to you both for coming on.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Buick.
That's it, folks, for our little saunter into the Anglo-German world of technical education. Do join us next week for a dedicated programme, as I was just saying there, on the Lifetime Skills Guarantee. It's obviously the big news this week. To say that the City and Guilds Supremo, Kirsty Donnelly, she hasn't been on the show for a while, but she is just a bit skeptical about it all is an understatement. And she'll be on the show next week talking to me, telling us all why. Thanks as ever to the Skills World Live team, Gavin O'Mara at FE News, and of course, the fab Ellie Hansen, our digital producer. Leaving you now with a brand new track from London Grammar. It's called Baby It's You. I once saw them live in Berlin. This melodic pop trio had gone quiet for a few years, but it turns out they're making a brand new album. And I can't wait to hear it, and in particular Hannah Reid's wonderful, angelic voice. Enjoy, and see you next week.
All these lights are changing, see them everywhere. In my veins like lightning, I don't even care. And the crowd is heavy, I don't wanna move. All these colors in me, but all I see is you. And nothing else matters. You, baby, it's you. You, baby, it's you. You.
remember to subscribe to Skills World Live at fenews.co.uk or just download the show from any one of your favourite podcasting sites, including iTunes, Spotify and Spreaker. Your world, Skills World.